federal court in Atlanta rules that Marjorie Taylor Greene must testify on Friday in her defense under the Insurrection Disqualification Clause of the 14th Amendment. Twitter swallows a poison pill trying to stave off a hostile takeover by billionaire Elon Musk, who seeks to make the platform a mecca of some kind for free speech. Has he ever been on Twitter? Jesus. Dear Lord. And the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention asked the Justice Department to appeal a recent ruling striking down mask mandates on public transportation. They are risking legal precedent to permanently restrict the CDC authority. But tonight, on day 56 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we host Commander McMillan as we discuss Putin's new doubling down on Russia and a complete change in everything going on the ground there, as Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov announced what we have already deduced, the next stage of the military operation in Ukraine. This is Overtime. Hello, welcome to Overtime. With me today is Commander McMillan, and but before we begin, it's amazing. We're coming up on 60 days, and it's 60 days that we've been covering this. It's been absolutely remarkable, and I'd like to discuss with you, Commander, at one point as well, something that is troubling that we've sort of only been on the cusp about, which is how much larger is this, or can this get? We saw Michael Clark, who is a commentator for Sky News, saying that he believes that this was in fact only the beginning of a larger conflict, and in fact an attempted revision of the world order, and that China, Brazil, African states are holding back to see what happens, and if Russia is in fact successful here, that this will be a green light for other countries to attempt this kind of thing. But I want to show you before we start here, as we're talking about this. This is the map, and actually that's that one is that says that's from April 1st. I don't think that is actually April 1st. Let me see if I can find the April 1st one here. That should be April 1st right there. And one of the things that you can see is there's a good deal more red. There's these, they're making serious attacks on Kyiv, on Kharkiv. They have these pincers here trying to go towards and encircle the capital. There are attacks happening throughout the entire country. And then we go to today, where it is a markedly different map. All of these cities appear to be completely free. Those of you who've been following us, for any length of time, recall distinctly going over all of the encroaching red areas here, and it's all but gone except for this line right here, about 350 miles of a brand new. Well, brand new, maybe a little, but essentially a new front. Russia has strategically withdrawn in most of the northern areas and has attempted now a second push, and this time they're going at it rather differently, and maybe somewhat the same. We're going to talk about it. This is absolutely not my area of expertise, so please, everyone, welcome a regular, aren't you lucky, to the show, Commander McMillan. Commander, welcome back. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm doing okay. It's been an interesting couple of weeks watching this all developing.
It has been. I will tell you, intellectually, I knew there was because of something that you and I had talked about. And you've mentioned this repeatedly. I've often heard it said. I'm an educator, and one of the things that I've said and I've heard said repeatedly is 90% of learning is forgetting. You learn something, you forget. You learn, you forget. You learn, you forget, and then eventually you remember it. And that's one reason why. Yeah. And in my case, it takes sometimes a couple whacks with that to whacks to the head. But all that notwithstanding, One of the things that you've said repeatedly, and I think is really important, and I want to make sure we talk about tonight, but that actually really unfortunately kind of sunk in, was that Putin can't leave this without a victory of some kind. It's just the mission accomplished banner that Bush had used. And it doesn't really matter if he's accomplished it or not. What matters is that he can sell that he's accomplished it. So that's going to be. Yep. His goal. So it looked almost like, a complete Ukrainian victory. The Russians withdrew from basically every element of this, but you had said that they would be back, and you had said why in our discussion on logistics, roughly when they'd be back and why it would take the amount of time that it did. And lo and behold, here they are with what appears to be a reasonably new strategy. How much has changed overall, I think, is genuinely an important question. But it's been almost 60 days now. You've been with us really since well beforehand. And I just, on behalf of everybody here on In Time, I would like to say thank you very much for your continued coming on to this show. It's been, I think, it's been a real learning experience for me, and hopefully very much so for our audience. So thank you once again for joining us as we near really the 60-day mark, which all said and done, while I've learned a lot and while it's been a pleasure meeting you and doing these shows with you, rather none of it had been necessary, but since it was, thank you for coming.
Well, it's been interesting being here. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, well, that's 9 times out of 10 when you check the box on as you're leaving the show and say, hey, what'd you think about the show? It was interesting. So you're in good company. That's the top most given answer. So could you remind our audience who you are and your experience in the military, in the U.S. military, please?
Sure. I was in the Navy for 25 years. I was a specialist in operational logistics and amphibious operations. I worked with all 3 other services other than the Navy and the Coast Guard as well. I was a accredited joint services officer, and I was the primary logistics planner for the lead up to the invasion of Iraq.
And congratulations on making logistics sexy. I'm impressed. That was a really good show. Between you and his Andring, well, it's something that, oh my God, it's one of those. Guy goes out fishing, and he's on the lake, and he sees 2 fish in the water, and he bends over and he goes, "Hey boys, how's the water?" One fish turns to the other fish and goes, "What's water?" And I got to tell, logistics is one of those things. It's all around us. It's absolutely everything. And it is amazing how a focus on that really seems to make the difference 9 times out of 10. And that's been recognized since Sun Tzu, going back to The Art of War, but it's more than just. It was anyways. It was a great show. We'll link it in the bottom for people who want to see it. That's going to go down, I think, as one of my favorite in terms of just educational content. So thank you for that. So what are we looking at here? This is to my eye, it looks like a very different map. It's all of the extraneous red stuff that was in the middle and on the north there seems to be gone, and they seem to be much more focused. Are they giving up? Is this a last gasp, or are they pretty serious about doubling down on this?
I think what this is they attempted a high-risk, high-reward operation at Kiev, kind of, like the Allies did in World War II with Market Garden. And it failed to pan out. It cost them enormous casualties and loss of equipment. So they've said, let's forget that. Let's go to where we've had some success and reinforce success, which is a standard thing you do in military operations. You know, reinforcing failure simply leads to further failure. Reinforcing success hopefully leads to even more successes. That's what they're pursuing here. The other thing that's pretty evident is that when you do this kind of operation where they're doing it, it is securing the one goal that they can obviously try to achieve, even if they have to negotiate a settlement, which is that, yeah, we still own Donetsk and Luhansk. We'll withdraw from the other territories, but that's legitimately ours. We physically occupy it. We've driven you completely out of it. No more Ukrainians are living there because we've deported them all to the Gulag.
Yeah.
You know, so that goes kind of simply for them. You don't have to conduct logistics through a friendly foreign country. You're doing it through your own country. You're not having to deal with the problems that diplomatic relationships cause in that. And as I think we saw during the operation, the Belarusians were getting increasingly irritated with how badly things were going and how their own men were saying, this is bullshit. We don't want to play.
Belarusians. That's actually, I don't think you've used that one before. That's a new. I like that one. So now there's been some discussion about whether or not he would continue at this point once again to at a minimum go all the way back to what was originally considered to be sort of the fallback point, the Dnipro River. I mean, it seems to me that if he has any success here, he's going to keep going. I don't think Putin thinks in terms of fallback positions. I think he thinks in terms of, okay, I'm back down a couple rungs on the ladder, but his goal is still to get to the top of the ladder. So is there any reason to think his goal is not to still at some point take all of Ukraine?
I think that's his goal, but I think as the impact of the sanctions begins to really strike home, and his own people begin to get increasingly frustrated and irritated with what's happening, there may be increased pressure for him to have to pull a mission accomplished exit strategy. So this at least allows a degree of that.
All right, and so that would be essentially like whoever's got the ball at the end wins. What he's going to say is, look, Luhansk and Donetsk have said they're independent. They don't want to be a part of Ukraine anymore. We own it anyway. We are here. So we're obviously going to keep it, and this is the new border, which is kind of what they did with Crimea. So they would ostensibly walk away with Crimea, with the Donbass region, and I would imagine nobody would in their right mind think that they're not going to invade again. This is their third invasion in 6 to 8 years, but at least for now, it would sort of stop there. What advantages do they have now? They are still, nonetheless, apparently, and I say apparently because they haven't made as much progress as people were anticipating. It's kind of hard to say what you'd anticipate at this point, given what we've seen, but. This is more urban warfare, if I understand correctly. It's somewhat better fitted for tanks. That would be a little bit more naturally an environment that's best for them. But on the flip side, that entire line has been a war zone for the Ukrainians for almost 8 years. And they've been fighting it for a while. They know it. 40% of their military is
fortified.
And it's okay. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the areas where there's combat has been active combat prior to the invasion. in many ways resemble World War I style trench lines.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're, 50 to 100 meters apart, well dug in, underground bunkers, and, they just rotate troops in and out of the line and snipe at each other and lob the occasional artillery shell. Trying to conduct a mechanized assault across such terrain is going to be difficult and costly. So you're not going to see the same kind of dramatic advances that you saw in the early part of this war if they do that. The other thing is that the Ukrainians pretty much know this is what they're going to be doing because they so thoroughly broadcast their intentions ahead of time that I'm sure they've reinforced all the key sectors there. And the Ukrainians are definitely, their military is very good in defensive tactics. We've seen that in the 60 days or so of fighting. I don't think they're as capable offensively. That's why, yes, we have seen limited Ukrainian counteroffensives, and they've done fairly well, but you always take more casualties when you're attacking than you do when you're defending. And to have a successful attack, you typically, the standard rubric is you need a 3-to-1 advantage to be assured that you're going to be successful. And I don't think the Ukrainians really have those kind of numbers. So as long as the Russians can keep grinding slowly forward, it's a likely victory scenario for them in the long run. What's the cost going to be? Horrendous. But I think we've already seen that Pooters doesn't give a damn about what happens to the troops in the field.
I think that's and in fact the sinking of the Moskva. There was a father who has said, "Look, we're being lied to. I want to know what happened to my son." And apparently they've said that there were no. I love it's. Oh dear Lord! So the Moskva got hit by apparently two torpedoes. It sank.
I thought it was missiles. Neptune.
It was missiles. I think you're right. It was Neptune missiles. My apologies. Well, you see, this is I know I don't know the difference. So, but it was
the torpedo.
There you go. So, I did misspeak. I'm sorry. It was converted into a underwater a submarine. It was converted to a submarine. I guess that's the terminology that the Russians are using. And they said that there was a fire on board, which tends to happen when you get hit by a missile. At least that's my understanding of how missiles work. But I love it's really kind of amazing to see how they spin this. It is true that yes, there was a fire on board, but okay. And U.S. intelligence has confirmed that in fact it was two missiles that struck it. It was now. I see the ship, and many people have misspoken and said that it was the flagship of the Russian fleet. It was the flagship of the
Black Sea Fleet.
The Black Sea Fleet. But that's a much smaller. I mean, you take a look at that ship, and that's not a particularly impressive ship. Even it looked like it was kind of. I'm sorry, it looked like a kind of a boat floating anyway.
Well, it's a bit over 30 years old.
Mm-hmm.
It has been through one significant major overhaul, but not many of the primary weapon systems were modernized. So it's a 30-year-old ship. It's a very capable ship, but the one thing that we always understood looking at Russian ships when I was in the Navy is that they're kind of one-shot wonders. The Russians put a ship to sea and they've kind of already written it off when it leaves the pier.
Really?
Because they honestly don't expect that it's going to get home. If you look at an American ship, topside or even on the interior, There's a firefighting station about every 20 to 30 feet. They're everywhere on these ships. I took a tour of a Russian guided missile destroyer when we did a joint exercise with them in Hawaii while I was still on active duty, when friendlier times, pre-Putin. And we got to tour this Russian guided missile destroyer. And every one of the enlisted and officers that I was with that came away, and we were all looking at each other, did you notice? There's almost no firefighting equipment on that ship. There was one firefighting station forward and a water cannon over the helo deck, so if they had a helicopter crash, they could, spray foam on it. That was it. And, to us, it was like, if this ship gets hit with anything and a fire starts, it's going to burn to the water line. There's no ability to fight a fire. Conversely, you look at so many American ships in recent times that have had really catastrophic damage done to them, and they survive. What is it? The Stark got hit with an Exocet missile, and it was severely damaged, but it was still functional. And the Fitzgerald,
Battle of Midway. What was the ship? And then they ended up having to tow it, but it's still until the very last attack where the Japanese said, we're sinking this no matter what. they had it, but
I'm talking about recent ones, and
okay,
you look at the fire that happened on the forestall, which was an ammunition handling accident, so it's not even enemy action. But I mean, the ship is literally engulfed in flame. It doesn't sink. It's not functional anymore, but it's under its own power, and it makes it back to Pearl and gets repaired. The Americans in particular, but virtually everybody in NATO, damage control is a major, major focus on our warships. The Russians don't think that way. So even the smallest amount of damage on a Russian ship could very well do what we saw happen.
What's the likelihood that there was? I think most of ships that size carry one and or two nuclear warheads, but my understanding is that the crews don't like having the nuclear warheads on board. You're not really going to use them, is at least the likelihood, is the hope, and it just it creates a huge hassle for the crew. Do we know if the Moskva had any nuclear warheads on it, and if so, where are they now? Well, at the bottom of the sea, presumably.
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons they made such a big effort, even though it cost probably a good portion of the crew their lives of having to stay on board and continue to try to save a ship that was clearly already lost, is they didn't want to lose the nukes that she was carrying. I think that's why they put so much effort into it. Now, they're never going to admit there were nukes on board it when it sank, but, a ship with that kind of armament aboard, I think it's a pretty safe bet that there's a couple at least.
All right, so at some point someone's going to have to do a rescue operation because you don't want to leave those nukes there, aside from the fact, I guess, depending on the depth, they may leak, and even if they don't leak, you don't want weapons like that, I assume, out of anybody's hands.
Well, yeah, but there are other nukes that went down at sea that are still down there today. If you do a Google search, you can find some of them. I think there's a couple of American subs that had nukes on them when they went down, and I think there's also a French aircraft with a nuke on it crashed off the coast of Sardinia or Corsica. I can't remember which. And I don't think that weapon was ever recovered.
I always learn the most marvelous things when you're on board. Okay, so we're just leave the nukes down there. I have to imagine it's difficult for countries to retrieve them. So yeah. Okay, all right. So excuse me.
As if deep water recovery operations weren't complicated enough. Try doing it when the thing you're trying to recover is radioactive.
Oh dear Lord, yeah, but if the thing leaks now, it's probably a bigger problem for Ukraine if it leaks than for Russia, I would assume. But it's Ukraine's got enough, and so now the other thing is, of course, now as I understand it, and this has been unconfirmed, Russia refuses to confirm this, but to the best of our understanding, an entire battalion has been poisoned by entering the exclusion zone in Ukraine, and sorry,
Yeah.
for Chernobyl, and my understanding is that most of the exclusion zone is actually reasonably safe. The average radiation that you'd get there is about 30 times what you get a year, which isn't just a year through background radiation, which is still significant, but is tolerable for extended periods of time. But a lot of the radiation is heavy metals that have gotten deeper into the soil. The soil is protecting you if you dig up the soil, and there are hot spots there that are thousands of times stronger. But if you dig up the soil, you get exposed to a lot more than that. And they were digging trenches.
Let's put this in correct term. Yeah, trenches.
Please.
It's not digging up the soil; it's digging up the trenches.
Yeah. So
more importantly, you're drinking. You're eating, and Russians being Russians, they're smoking like chimneys too, all of which is bringing more radiation into their systems. They're sleeping on radioactive ground, et cetera, et cetera. And they were there for weeks. It's one thing to drive into the exclusion zone for a tour. I mean, they let you do that, actually. And you go see it, and then you're out in a couple of hours. These guys were there for weeks rolling around in radioactive dirt. What a surprise. They got sick.
So now I'm ambivalent about this one, and we did a show literally called "When Do You Punch a Nazi?" On the grounds that okay, I'm not a pacifist, but I have values, and free speech is one of them. Too, I'm not a free speech absolutist. You can't shout fire in a theater, and I agree with that. But for the most part, if somebody's saying abhorrent speech, hey, I'm thrilled because that means I know who all the assholes are. That's why I like it that the KKK can go out and protest, because I was like, okay, A, I know roughly how many of them there are, and B, nowadays the hood is a lot less popular. So I go out the hood, I was like, okay, he's an asshole, he's an asshole, he's an asshole. So you can count them and you know who they are. But, apparently, the UN tried to warn Russia, and the scientists working there said, listen, this is a really bad idea. Go set up your staging somewhere else. Don't do it in the exclusion zone. And they were completely ignored. And one of the scientists who was warning them finally said, yeah. At one point, I was like, you know what? Fine, invite your buddies. Bring as many people here as you can, because you're gonna ignore us anyway. Let's just watch you all die and poison yourselves. Did they not care? Which it kind of sounds like to the Russian mindset, and I'm always very careful when I say things like this, because I think we have a tendency to try to dehumanize, obviously, our opponents, and I'm always suspicious of people who say, well, the Russians don't love their children like we do. The Russians don't love their soldiers like we do. They don't love their homes like we do. So I try to be very careful of that, because it's very easy to do when it's usually not true. But it seems like when you talk about the ships, when you talk about what they were doing this, either they didn't believe the international community and the Ukrainian soldiers, or they just didn't care, and they're like, well, we're going to lose soldiers. This is the job. This is what we're doing, and they just really didn't care. Any thoughts as to why they went forward with this?
I suspect they listened to the scientists, and kind of like we've seen in our country with a certain group of red-hatted individuals, you dismiss them as scientists because they're not worthy, and you don't listen to them, and you go in and you do what you want, figuring, oh, what does he know? He only went to college. And these things happen. I don't think it's a case of they don't love their children, care about their troops. Sure they do, but I don't think are willing to think logically through this and do a planning for an operation the way we do, where you bring in the experts from every field and have them enter their 2 cents into the plan about this needs to be done because of this. And if you don't do this, this is going to happen, and everybody has their input. I've always kind of gotten the impression with the Russian planning cycle is that they kind of just, the boss comes up with a plan and everybody dutifully jumps around to make his plan a reality without talking to the people that would know better.
Yeah, that was what Stalin did. That's why 40 million.
Yeah, I don't.
I'm starved to death. Yeah,
I don't.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's changed in Russia. It's, the czar and the boyars make all the decisions, and everybody else just lives with it.
All right. So let's talk about this frontier. Now, a lot of the initial assault was conscripts. We've discussed that in the past. We know some of it was also prisoners, and they were being forced to fight. And there was a disproportionate number of them, so non-ethnic Russians, in fact, that died, we believe, in the first attack. We don't know if that is because they just were poorer soldiers or because they were pushed to the front. There's some indication, at least, that the generals were pushed to the front, and that's why we were killing so many of them. But that was done ostensibly to boost morale. At this point, we believe that the Russians have conscripted another 130,000 troops, most of them not ethnic Russians, for this new assault.
Yep.
That's so where are they getting them, and how ready are these guys? Do you believe the reports? Some of these are very hard to confirm. Some of them you can confirm, but the reports of shooting their own commanders, and yeah, I'm sorry, please.
Yeah, I'll put it this way: the Russians they're still using a conscripted system for the most part, and they bring in a new influx of recruits twice a year. I can't remember exactly, but I think it's in April and October. And 100-something thousand is about the right number that they would bring in. Their troops stay on active service for about a year, and then they are discharged into the reserves. And I think I've mentioned this before, but unlike our reserves, who drill once a week, or excuse me, one weekend every month, and for 2 weeks once a year. A Russian reservist, if he drills at all, only basically is checking in at the post office for the most part, just saying, yep, I'm still registered as a member of the reserves. They don't do any actual training per se. Less than 10% of their military, after they've left service, do anything still, doing training and such. And literally that training is showing up at the reserve center to say, I'm still alive, and going home. So if they're bringing in new recruits and they're mobilizing reservists, these are all green troops. They will have no prior training, no combat experience or anything. The elite troops, and those were the elite troops that did the initial assaults, those guys have been badly depleted, and they need time to reorganize, reconstitute, bring in new troops, get trained up, and get re-equipped. So the offensives that are going to be going on for the foreseeable future, for the next couple of months, are either second echelon formations that did not participate in the initial assault, that are being brought in from other areas. Those will be not elite, but they're not raw recruits, or raw recruits who are basically being rushed through a training regimen and sent to the front. Their officers will be inexperienced, have no connection with the troops they're commanding. They're just going to show up and try to do stuff. And again, this is very reminiscent of what happened with Russia in the opening days of the German invasion in World War II, where you started throwing huge mass numbers of troops into offensives simply to try to slow down the Germans. And, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, actually, of troops were being killed or taken prisoner in those opening months. That was the highest set of casualty figures that the Russian army experienced during the war, is that opening 3 or 4 months. And I suspect that what we're going to be seeing is something kind of similar here, that they're trying to buy time so they can bring in better equipped, better trained troops constituted from these reserves and the new conscripts to keep going. But that takes time. You can't train somebody to operate sophisticated modern weaponry in just a couple of days or even a couple of weeks. It takes time. And that was one of the things that always struck me as odd, is when you looked at the number of officers aboard a Russian ship as opposed to a NATO or an American ship. And they probably had 50% more officers on board their ship. And that was because they didn't trust their enlisted personnel to operate the equipment. The enlisted personnel on a Russian ship were there to clean things and be dumb manual labor. The only ones who knew how to operate the advanced missile systems and that sort of thing, those were the officers. And you can't throw brand new officers without sending them through specialty training, and that takes time. If you want to be in charge of a tank platoon or a tank company, you've got to work your way up to being capable of doing that, and that's going to take time for the Russians to do. The only alternative is to source those leadership slots from other units in other sectors, replacing those other sectors with brand new newly commissioned officers. Why is this a risk? Well, if the Chinese decide to get frisky in Siberia, if Iran decides to get frisky, there's so many, and start backing the Chechen rebels again or something. The Russians have to make choices about prioritizing what they're going to do. And so if the Ukraine is their number one objective, it creates vulnerabilities for them security-wise in other regions.
Well, it seems to me that time is the one thing that Zelensky actually is sort of banking on, because the longer this goes, the more the Russian people, hopefully start to learn the truth. I mean, Putin is only about 75 to 80% sitting on this, and it looks like it's actually probably even less than that, given how many things people have gotten away with saying on air and Russian state media so far. I mean, it's the exception that proves the rule. We see somebody go on air and say, okay, Putin has completely screwed this up. And you sit there and say, wow, somebody said that, who cares? That's huge. I mean, that somebody would have the balls to say that without worrying too much about getting assassinated. He's losing control of this. So Zelensky, it seems to me, is just waiting for this to turn enough that Putin gets deposed, presumably with extreme prejudice. Excuse me.
Yeah, but the other side to that is that the longer it goes on, the more damage the sanctions are going to do to the Russian economy. And as that happens, more and more average Russians are going to get really pissed off.
So, all right. So my hope is that they don't have the kind of time that it looks like we're talking about here. I do want to run some numbers through and see if this sounds about right and if I'm missing anything. So their supply lines by this map, as I understand it's actually somewhat better. And the reason is because they can get it straight from Russia. They don't have to really guard their supply lines. It's, as you said, it's basically going through friendly territory. However, they're almost out of precision-guided weapons, and they can't make any more because the sanctions have dried up their supply parts. They can't make any more T-80s and T-90s, any of their real modern tanks. They have 15,000 reserve tanks. Excuse me. Oh, this is God's way of saying that I need to be letting my guests speak more. But that's not going to happen. Let's see. But only 25%. Intelligence estimates that only 25% of those are battle ready. And you had mentioned too. So.
Oh yeah, you see these pictures.
Yep.
You can do this on Google Earth and just look at them. They're these huge repositories of tanks left over from the Cold War. They have kept them on the roster as reserve equipment. But you look at these things, and I mean, they literally haven't been driven or maintained in decades. So if the top of the line stuff is having all the problems we've been seeing, you can imagine what it's going to be like if they try taking this stuff out of open air storage, in the middle of nowhere. It none of it's going to work.
Well, and the weather famously played a huge role in World War II in the invasion of Russia. How's the weather going to affect this?
Actually, the weather in this situation, in the long term, at least, well, it depends on how you define long term. The spring thaw is going to last until about mid-June.
Okay.
I know that seems odd for us, but that's historically what happens. And once that period is over, the ground will have dried out enough for tanks to be able to maneuver off-road fairly well. And that will persist up until probably late September, early October, when the autumn Rasputitsa will hit. They have 2 of these every year. It literally means mud road, I think, but it literally, everything turns to mush. And if you're not driving on a hard surface road, you're, axle deep in the mud. But from that period, from mid-June until, say, October, the ground's going to be conducive to mechanized, motorized, whatever operations cross-country. And that favors the Russians because they won't be as road-bound as they have been. And that's been one of the blessings of this idiotic plan they came up with for the Ukrainians, is that they've had to pretty much stay road-bound the entire time, which makes it fairly easy to set up ambushes. Once the ground dries out, that isn't going to be the case anymore.
All right, so it sounds like what we're looking at is a much slower campaign. It looks like they're still going to be really trying for as much of Ukraine as possible, but they're going to be much more methodical, slower, and presumably this time keeping their tanks, infantry, and Air Force all much tighter and closer together, which, as I understand it, was sort of one of the issues they had in their first campaign. But it looks still, and okay, look, they're short all their best tanks. They're going to be using reserve tanks that are from the 60s and 70s. They're running out of precision-guided weapons, but they've got a lot of people. They've got a lot of conscripts, and it looks like, to me, they're just as determined as ever. Is that roughly what we're looking at?
I think so. I think that's a very good summation of what's going on.
All right. So, what do you think? This is. I've asked you this before. I'm going to continue to ask you this. You still come on anyway. Yeah. So, we're still gonna, but this is the kind of. So, what are we looking at? Say short term. Do you think next 2-3 weeks? Midterm, next month or two, and then long term. What's the? I think. Long term, it sounds to me like we're it's almost a game of chicken. See who
Yeah.
quits first. But anyway, so on those sort of three, what are
Sure.
your best guesses looking at this for those three
Okay.
timeframes?
My best guess for the short term is we're going to see a slow, grinding, very costly Russian assault trying to advance to the Donuts, the river that's out there.
Yep.
And they're going to be doing the best they can, and it's going to be really tough going for them. If the Ukrainians can bring in enough reserves to help staunch that flow, it will probably not gain significant territory, and it will cost them a lot of troops. But that depends on how willing they are to redeploy a lot of troops that were in the Kiev, or how are we supposed to pronounce it now? Kiev
Kyiv, yeah.
area. I I use the old pronunciation. I'm sorry, it's what I know.
I still do. I speak Russian. I learned Russian, and since I learned Russian, I learned it as Kiev, and I've had a hell of a time, but it's important, I think. So yeah, but you and I, we're in the same boat. We're in the same boat. So
Well, yours is from the Russian side. I know mine from the German side.
oh,
Anyway, the the forces that were defending Kiev could be redeployed, but that leaves that area vulnerable potentially to a renewed offensive coming out of Belarus. So how risk adverse is Zelensky? I don't know. So that's going to be a major influence on what's going on here. There is the potential that the Ukrainians could be real cagey about this and allow some sector of the front to advance further than it should, so they can mount a limited counterattack and cut off one of the spearheads and systematically reduce it. But I don't know. I think a lot depends on how the Ukrainians get resupplied. As long as we keep just sending them, guided missiles, Stingers, javelins, what have you, they're still on the defensive. Those aren't offensive weapons. There has been talk about trying to get them more aircraft. There's been talk about trying to get them more armor, and in particular, get them more artillery. Those will open up the possibility for some potential major offensive efforts by them. Major, let's call it limited offensives. So that's the short-term picture I see.
okay.
The medium-term picture, I don't really know. And I think a lot of it depends on, as I've been saying all along, what goes on domestically inside Russia. If Putin is able to continue to keep the lid on the information war so that his people are, like mushrooms in the dark and fed crap, then that may not be as dangerous as it could be. But as you say, more and more information is leaking through the new Iron Curtain that he's trying to slam down. So how well that's received is another question. I read an interesting article, and if I could find it, I'd forward it to you. Somebody said, this isn't really a war between Russia and NATO, or Russia and the US, or China using Russia as its proxy and the US using Ukraine as its proxy to fight a war between each other. The article postulated this is really a battle of memes, which is that the Russians have always maintained there is no actual independent Ukrainian identity.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at what's been coming out of Russia recently, it's it's like reading the same propaganda you saw with the Germans identifying international Jewry as, animals and rats and vermin and so forth. It's the same kind of way they're treating things here. And that preceded the war. It even preceded, to some extent, the whole dissolution of the USSR. The Ukrainians were always seen as very much second-class citizens who were supposed to be good, obedient servants to the Russian overlords. And it's the Russian ruling elites who are dictating this pattern of, we don't want to lose our supremacy in what we view as our traditional tribal lands. And that's kind of what's going on. So, and that message has enormous appeal to the average Russian. So even as information leaks through the information Iron Curtain, I don't see that it is going to have as much impact as everybody hopes it's going to have on the people, because the Russians are already predisposed. Think of it as the American South during the Civil War, as if somebody were saying, well, yeah, all you have to do is let the blacks be free and vote. That it would never have entered the average Southerner's mind that would be something that would ever happen. And I think to some extent that's what we're dealing with here with Russians and their mental view of the Ukrainians. So in the midterm, I think it's all really about not the conventional battlefield, it's about what happens inside Russia. And that's the real war that's going on for the heart and soul of Russia. At the same time, you've also got a related issue, which is Putin's going to be under more and more pressure. So he's going to want to try to desperately find a way out of what's going to be an impasse, a quagmire. If he goes the WMD route, then I think all bets are off. I don't think anybody can predict how the U.S. and NATO are going to react to that.
Okay.
And I could easily see that being the trigger that brings in an intervention, maybe a limited intervention, just like, the no-fly zone over the Ukraine or something. But nonetheless, once you take that tiny first step, you've basically crossed a boundary that escalates this whole thing into a much bigger conflict.
You had, and by the way, yeah, please send me that article. And I always am very appreciative of all the things that you send me. I know Discord is not you're not normally like a Discord like junkie, but I'm on it 24/7, so it's the easiest way to reach me. And I always appreciate your insights. You had sent me an article on the possible use of, I think it was sarin gas in Mariupol.
Yeah.
And we haven't actually discussed Mariupol too much. I did want to mention that. I also want to start wrapping this up. But Mariupol is an interesting one. We had said about a week ago that Mariupol had hours left, and indeed, I think it was about 800 Marines surrendered. But at the it's the largest steel mill in Europe. There is, first of all, what appears to be 1,000 civilians. The number may be as low as about 400, but there's between 400 and 1,000 civilians there. The steel factory had a large number of underground tunnels to get from building to building, and this wasn't with any military strategy in mind. It was really just what the business had done in order to facilitate moving things back and forth, and so these tunnels have proven very effective. But they dropped a huge bunker buster bomb. In fact, we've got an image of that, and I can't fathom that anybody survived this, but apparently they did. Now, this was dropped, I think it was earlier today. No, it was yesterday. Apparently, there are still people there. They're still holding out. Mariupol, for all intents and purposes, has fallen. Actually, let's just quickly look at the map here. It's the only bit that's left. All they needed was the road, and they now have the road. The only bit that's left is this steel mill right here, and there's civilians there. There's a military presence there. Our understanding is they're virtually out of ammunition, but they have said they will not give it up. This has turned into essentially the Alamo. It's utterly insane. But this was the what was it? It was a I forget but this was heard apparently as much as over 50 miles away. This is the detonation of what we believe was a bunker buster bomb into that steel mill, and apparently they are still there. Um, what can you tell us about? It's obviously now become much more of a psychological thing. They have the city all but this territory. What's going on over there?
The one thing that everybody seems to have forgotten that was learned in World War II is that when you decide to shell an urban environment because you're meeting resistance from people taking pot shots out of buildings, you actually make it a more defensible position.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's much easier to take shelter in rubble and hide things in rubble than it is in an actual standing building. And I think that may be part of why this has held out as long as it has. Eventually, however, they're going to run out of food, water, ammunition, medicine, what have you. And they're going to have to either capitulate or take the Masada route. I think, we're going to see some Ukrainian postage stamp sad fact of the martyrs of Mariupol.
Well,
I don't think the Russians have already said they issued an ultimatum, and if you didn't surrender by that time, you were going to be killed. They weren't going to take prisoners.
Yeah. The Russians, by the way, also, I don't know if you've heard, have already planned their victory celebration, which I actually think is a good sign. Let me see if I can find the specs on this. This was they've begun preparations for a Victory Day parade in Moscow, rehearsing with more than 11,000 troops. You'd think maybe they could use those in the war, but I'm not an expert.
What's an extra division at the front?
Yeah. They have planned apparently 8 MiG-29 planes flying in a Z formation, and we have the video footage of that in the Discord. And I'll remind people, come onto the Discord. I'm gonna. I know we're a little later for you. I will definitely, as long as I'm not hacking up another furball, I'll be in the Discord for a little while after the show. So I hope if you have time, you'll be able to join us. But we've got on the Discord, we have really bleeding edge of what's been going on here in this and in other news. Obviously Ukraine has been occupying our attention quite a bit, but at the top of the show I mentioned a few other stories that we have been following in that Discord. So I hope you'll go down to the Discord and check it out. I did have a question. So we were talking about possible use of sarin gas. There were a number of false accusations of white phosphorus that turned out to be incendiary rounds. The use of sarin gas has not yet been confirmed by the U.S. It was used presumably on the 11th. That's what the Ukrainians are saying. The Ukrainians have some incentive to make this up. On the flip side, they've been reasonably accurate in my view so far. I had heard a theory that, in fact, it had been used. The U.S. knew it had been used, but the U.S. doesn't want to force NATO's hand, so the U.S. is dragging its feet on that declaration. Any thoughts?
Honestly, I don't know. I think suppressing the information, if it is in fact a chemical weapon deployment, is certainly a possibility, because once that magic imaginary line has been crossed, it completely changes the nature and rules of the game. And I think both the European Council, our president, and NATO command hierarchy would all prefer that if we're going to get involved, it be something that is very obvious, very undeniable that the Russians have crossed the threshold, not something that you can, arguably say, oh no, it was all a misunderstanding. It was, propaganda. You're lying to. And I think that's what they want. If it comes push to shove, that it's be something very, very undeniable.
All right, so let me. And maybe I'm reading too much into what you're saying here, or I'm certainly starting to get a little tired here. But yeah, are you suggesting then that if this was used, it seemed like, okay, so the accusation was that sarin gas had been used in a warhead, and they had a number of people who ostensibly had not died but had chemical burns. And according to the Ukrainians, they say they believe it was sarin gas. To the best of my recollection, nobody had claimed to have died. So it was an extremely limited use, ostensibly a test use, just to even see if the sarin gas could be deployed.
If it was real sarin gas, trust me, it would be pretty obvious that was it, not chemical burns and such.
All right.
So, and you don't launch one chemical shell at a target. If you're going to use it, you use it en masse across a large area. So I think that is evidence that points at this being something else. It could have been white phosphorus. It could have been a round that hit, some industrial chemical storage place. Anything that just caused some sort of irritant to get loose and cause problems, maybe even a few deaths. But I don't think the evidence right now supports the idea that it was sarin gas, but it's still a possibility. You can't rule it out.
All right. And then lastly, so we also today, I think it was confirmed by a U.S. defense official that in the past 24 hours, they've begun training Ukrainian personnel on 155 millimeter howitzers. They're being trained in Europe. The howitzers have arrived in Europe, and let's see. Oh no, sorry. They're on cargo flights to Europe, and more are on the way. So this represents, as I understand it, a change in the military hardware to more offensive weaponry, as you were talking about. Is that accurate? Yes. And all right. So what's the significance of the?
That's my understanding. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is a weapon. I don't think we're still using the 155 towed, and I think that's what we're talking about here is towed howitzers. Mm. They were phasing them out, and only the Marines were really using them when I was still on active duty, and they have since converted to other equipment. So these are kind of surplus weapons on our part, giving them to them. It's a very, very good weapon. But towed artillery has got limitations. I read somewhere that the Germans were also giving, I think it was the Germans, were giving the Ukrainians a number of 155 millimeter self-propelled guns. So mobile artillery. So when you combine that with the other stuff, and if they're getting ex-Soviet tanks from various other NATO members, like, say, Poland or Romania, who are buying more modern tanks from the West, there's only minimum retraining time going to be required because it's a Russian tank, which are what pretty much the Ukrainians have been training on all along. So that is going to give them more equipment to be able to potentially mount some sort of counterattack.
All right. Well, Commander McMillan, it has been very helpful and productive as always. Thank you so much for your time. We're going to, I think, be retiring for the evening. I'll definitely be in the live chat. Do you think you may be able to, or sorry, in the Discord for a little bit? Are you going to have some time to join us, or I know it's a little later for you. It's another hour, so we've been we've already taken up a lot of your time. But I was curious if you might have a little time in the Discord.
Yeah, I'll try to pop by for 15, 20 minutes or so.
Marvelous. Well, thank you so much for your time. So once again, so we'll be in the voice chat on the Discord for a little bit. I'll be in there as long as I can talk without blowing people's eardrums out. But thank you very much for that. We were going to do a show tomorrow on John Oliver's show on trucking. We were going to do a breakdown on some of that, both in keeping with the logistics, and I'm a fan of John Oliver, but I think it's worth breaking down one of his breakdowns and see how accurate he is. I think he's got some right, and some stuff maybe could use some work there, but I'm not sure yet. I don't want to push it too much, and I'm still not completely recovered yet. So we'll play that by ear. It'll be soon, if not tomorrow, very, very soon. But thank you once again, Commander McMillan, and look forward to catching up with you on the Discord and next time. Thank you once again for coming on.
Thank you.
All right, have a good evening all. See you in the Discord in about 5 minutes. Good night.